Hey, Chris.
Hey, Maggie.
So it's just the two of us today. I thought would be cool was to have kind of those deeper conversations around each chapter of the book. And maybe not necessarily the entire chapter, but something out of each chapter and have just a candid conversation. So I invited you today because your story about you and I is in chapter 1.
Yes.
So for context, Chris, will you just give us a quick version of the story in case people haven't read it yet?
Sure. So a while back before we published the book, we had a lot of things going on. And Maggie, you were asked to lead a number of initiatives around marketing, website, and all of these sort of, I would say, high visibility, high risk, high profile projects. And you were newer to the organization than you are now, of course. But you were also sort of trying to get your bearings on a lot of things between transitioning from a client project into this work. Let me know if I'm not getting context accurately.
No, that's correct. It was my very first internal project ever. I was on this one large account my whole time at Softlight up until this point.
And so, and I was sort of this sounds like a really fancy title. I was the executive sponsor for the work that you were in, right? So it was under my purview. It was something that I was accountable for to the rest of the organization, including Mohammed, the CEO. And in the midst of all of that, a lot of other things were swirling and plate spinning. Not that as an excuse, but you would be setting up these one-on-ones to get time with me to go through what you were struggling with, what you had questions on, what you needed direction on, just like it was big and small stuff. So it wasn't that, it was just like, oh my gosh, I needed help with everything. It was like you had some very pointed needs that you needed addressed, and you wanted it to be a collaborative decision and discussion versus you just making a guess or not knowing what I truly wanted or needed or expected. On my end, I didn't know all of that. Now I'm telling it in hindsight, right? But I didn't know all of that. And so I would be in meetings back to back, and a lot of my meetings would just keep going over and over. And it would unfortunately impede with or compete with your one-on-ones. And in my head, I would just say, like, Maggie knows that I'm in these meetings. She knows, she can see my schedule. She knows that I wouldn't just stand her up, right? And like that was again my mind telling me that, right? That was my fault, so you can say. Not that this is something that other leaders or anybody else should be doing, but this was just the way I justified, continuing on as is. And then one day you were, bold and brave to say, like, Chris, we're having this one-on-one. I need you to come to this one-on-one. Can you make this one-on-one? And I really need you to be there. Now I'm putting emphasis on it, but she was nice. She was polite. She wasn't like, just like, no, you better be like, it wasn't that type of style, but I could tell that you were serious about it and you really wanted to have it. And I was like, okay, I'll come. Right. And, this was when we were in person. This was pre-COVID. So go into the room and, you just sit me down and say, Chris, I feel like I'm not worth your time. I feel like you deprioritize things, and I keep trying to have these one-on-ones, and, no matter what I do, you don't show up. And so this is how I'm feeling. And that was like a slap in the face in the right way, in a good way. It was a good slap. And I was able to stop and really reflect and be like, holy crap, this entire time in my head, I've been thinking that you were okay because, it was like a matter of business. And I was thinking about all the busy things that I was doing, but I wasn't thinking about your feelings at all, to be honest. And that made me stop and think like, oh, wait, like she really wants time with me. And it took me back to when I was your age in your spot in my career. And if one of my senior leaders who I really was looking forward to meet with, or who I just needed to align with, because I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I could be making the wrong calls here, and you might see something I don't see, right? And to go back to that place and not have that, or not know why I was getting deprioritized, would have been a nightmare. And so at that moment, I immediately apologized, or not immediately. We had a conversation and I apologized, and I wanted to figure out what can I do to make it right. Right. I think anybody who's been on the sort of not so good side of an apology, right, is always thinking, what can I do differently? How would I make it right? What can I do right now versus later versus, of course, change my actions and communication style, etc. And I felt so bad because right after that, I had to go out of town for a business work trip. And I was like, I'm going to miss our next one. Right. So like in that conversation in my head, I'm like, I'm going to apologize, but I know I'm going to keep missing. Like I'm not going to be there next week because physically I'm going to be out of town. And so I just had the idea. I'm like, I'm going to have some flowers delivered. So even if I'm not there, something will be there to let her know that she means a lot to me and she means a lot to this organization. And I don't want her to ever feel like because I miss those, that's really what's going on in my head, that I don't value your time. So that was my side of the story. Not sure if I missed anything, but that was where I was at that moment.
Yeah. Two funny things. One, you put a note with those flowers and it said, "Of course you're worth my time. I'm sorry I've been bad at showing it." And the only reason I really remember that is because it's on my bulletin board
it
right next to me. Yeah, it's right. It's right there. This is hard. This little thing right there.
Got it.
So I kept it. And it's right there. And also it must have been right before COVID when this happened, because I remember coming back to the office maybe a year later to clean out all of our stuff. And those flowers were sitting on my desk and they were, they looked like a skeleton. And I was like, oh, like that was so sweet. But yeah, so first of all, I'm sure a lot of people have heard this story before. One, it's in the book. Two, we've talked about it publicly many times. But what I really wanted to do in this like short little conversation was just talk about, okay, then what? Like we had this cute story where we got to like tie it with a bow and it was sweet and great, but like what happened after that and how has our relationship grown, and where do you go after you have to have a hard conversation like that with a leader or a peer or anyone?
I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think on both sides, you're also thinking like, how do we not make this awkward for the future, right? Like, how do we, like our next meeting, our next one-on-one, how does it not be like this awkward, like typical rom-com, like, right? Like, and how do we get back to a place where we can communicate, get back to work, collaborate, right? And not let that be what defines the tenor of the conversation. And so I think immediately after that, I tried to make sure that you felt heard, but also asking you questions. Where are we with this? How are you feeling about this? What can I help you with? Instead of trying to like, so how are you feeling about that conversation last week? Like, do you like, give me some feedback on how before? Like, I think that is where some people tend to go with it, and that makes it unnatural. So for me, it was really about showing up to listen. Like, what do you need? Like, let's get down to brass tacks if that's where you are. And that was on my side, but not sure if you had any sort of tactics or things that you were doing to.
Yeah, I think the most helpful thing for me was the fact that, and we didn't really talk about this in the book, but I didn't really realize we did this until now, but we kind of set some working agreements between the two of us of like, hey, I'm not going to get upset every time you miss a one-on-one. I'm only going to get upset when you don't tell me that you're about to miss a one-on-one and I'm waiting in the room for 20 minutes and I didn't know you weren't coming. So it was good for me, and I want to say it was probably good for you to know it's okay that I'm not perfect, but I need to just at least communicate that I'm not going to be able to be there. And I think that aspect of it really helped us moving forward, because I didn't want you to feel like you were like, oh, I don't want to trigger Maggie again, or I don't want to, I'm like walking on eggshells around her from here on out. And I wouldn't want that personally for our relationship either. So I think that piece of it, of like the practical, okay, this is going to happen again. Like there's no way around it. Like things like this are going to happen again, but how do we ensure that we're thinking about the other person moving forward, even if, one of us fails to show up to a one-on-one in the future. So I thought that was a really important piece for me.
And I like going back, yes, that did happen. And we did have that conversation. And that also makes it very easy to slip into the solution and the path forward versus sitting in that awkward, tense, like, ooh.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that I've seen so many people, like whether at work or just personally, like after an apology or a crucial conversation, it never goes back. It just it never recovers. And I mean, there's a number of reasons why. And I think between you and I, because we both were intentional about committing to those working agreements, and then making sure that what we were and what you were working on with me was getting the attention, right? And where we had issues, even if it wasn't about a personal thing, we were able to return back to that place of like, okay, we know how to establish working agreements when something isn't working. And I think that I know in the book that we talk about that a little bit in certain areas, in certain places. But I think, one of the things that I always love in reading books is if you can get the behind the scenes, like, like, okay, so now what then? What happened to Maggie and Chris? Like, are they good? Are they not good? Right. And I think, if you are reading the book and you're looking at that story and it's really early into the book, I would say that oftentimes you've been on one side of that situation, right? And I know that I would not have had the courage that you had, Maggie, to go and tell my boss or anybody that had a title to change their ways, right? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have. I'm just saying I didn't have that courage, but I also was in an environment where that would have been welcomed.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes our story also unique, is that we had an environment where that was welcomed. And it's still welcomed, and it's something that we continue to work on and get better at, and figure things out, right? And I think that if you're reading the book and you haven't found that in a workplace, you have to start being that change, right?
Yeah. I think another like peek behind the curtain about this instance is I was talking to my supervisor, because you weren't necessarily a supervisor role for me at that point. So I was talking to a more like direct report type person about this situation before I had a conversation with you about it. And I was just like, man, I'm just so annoyed. Like, well, how am I supposed to like get anything done? And I was just kind of, to be honest, just straight up complaining, like not thinking of any kind of solution, just really just wanting to like be annoyed about it. And that person and one or two other people that I talked to about it really encouraged me, because we have that culture. And like you said, Chris, I was newer. I wasn't used to being able to have these conversations with leaders. It really encouraged me, like, no, you should talk to Chris about this. Like, it's not going to help you by coming to me and complaining to me about it, because I can't solve it. I can't make it right unless I go talk to Chris for you, which that's really stupid, basically. And I was like, yeah, no, I don't want you to do that. I'm not 12, like I want to, handle it myself. And that instance of someone encouraging me to then go talk to my leader, which I'd never done anything really like that before in my career, has then helped me be a better mentor to people that come to me and are like, man, I'm really annoyed about something that this other person did. And I'm like, okay, well, have you talked to them about it yet? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, why don't you try that first? And it sounds so silly, but like, I also see it happening in my personal life too. Like, I live with women. I live with roommates. I've had roommates since college. And so there's always conflict in roommate situations, because that's normal and it doesn't, whatever. But if one roommate comes to me and is like, I'm really annoyed that this other roommate didn't do this. And I'm like, did you tell them that you wanted them to? And they're like, well, no. Just go tell them. Like, it sounds so scary, but like, it doesn't have to be, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, confrontation, that's like a really like aggressive sounding word. It doesn't have to be angry. It doesn't have to be dramatic and emotional. It can be like, and Chris, you say this, but and Brene Brown says this, Clarity is kindness. And that's something that I personally try to practice, not only at work, but at home and with friends and family, because if people don't know my expectations, how do I hold them to those expectations?
Right. And I completely agree. And, it's funny you mentioned the fact that, someone said it would be stupid for me to go and talk to Chris for you, but that happens in so many organizations.
Yeah.
Like a small little, it could have been a miscommunication. It could have been a misfire. It could have been a misunderstanding, but it turns into something bigger because like, well, I'm going to tell my boss to go and talk to your boss about this. And since we can't, I'm not going to go and confront you directly, or I'm not going to have that conversation with you. And oftentimes you miss the opportunity to build clarity or build perspective, right? And when you approach it without the idea of a confrontation happening, but instead like, I wonder what else could be true of this interaction, or why am I feeling this way? Why are they doing what they're doing? Right. And you're going in that curious mind, you'll find that it actually will be a win-win conversation, because both parties will walk out like we did with an understanding of what the other party needs, but also how do we work together going forward, right? And that's where curiosity can lead to sort of these courageous events. But so many people are so afraid of the escalation side of it, because when you don't have emotional regulation, when you don't have, sort of the tools to be able to understand that most people do things not in spite of you or to attack you, but you are, oftentimes either collateral damage or an unintended impact, right? And so just knowing that, keep living and you'll be on one side of the other, right?
Yeah.
And how people approach it, it makes a difference in how the outcomes end up being. And oftentimes, like in my experience, when you approach it the way that you approached it, Maggie, with me, it isn't gonna lead to this sort of like, Cold War situation that just keeps escalating, where nobody is wanting to talk, or it's, mind games after that, and we're just gonna keep trying to get even with each other without actually doing, like clearly out of bound things. And I think those are the realities that many people still face inside of their companies and their teams.
Yeah. And we talk a lot about vulnerability in the book, and just in general at Softway. We talk a lot about it and about how that's kind of the key to building relationship with people. And I think a lot of times people hear that and think, oh, then I need to go to Chris and share that, my grandmother's dog died today. And so like, I'm feeling really sad. Like it doesn't have to mean that. It doesn't have to mean disclosing. It can, like it can definitely can and should to some degree. But that was also a moment of vulnerability for both of us, because I do think I cried in that meeting, probably, if I'm remembering correctly. And so that, to me, I don't cry in front of people a lot. And so that, to me, in and of itself, like me being that frustrated about the situation and nervous to like come to you and show those nerves, was vulnerable to me. And then you apologizing and being humble about it was vulnerable, I'm assuming, to you. And so that, I think, strengthened our relationship. Like we were friendly before then and had a basis of relationship, but I feel like from there on out, we had a much stronger relationship. And now we share TikToks every day almost.
And what's crazy is like going back to that specific conversation, I remember like in my head, I'm like, do I tell her that I've been like, it wasn't intentional, and hear all the things that I was doing while like, right? Anyone who's sort of put into that room would probably be thinking of like, how do I help her understand my side of this? How do I help her see that this was not intentional? And like, there's all these other things and all these other plates spinning. And then I was like, I don't think she cares about that, to be honest. I don't think she cares about that.
Well, I'll tell you this story, and it doesn't sound like it will relate, but I promise it does. So I have a nephew, and he's 4. And this year, so my sister had some accident where she broke her leg this year, and so she couldn't walk for like 2 months probably, and it happened to be over Halloween, so she couldn't go with her husband to take their 3 kids trick-or-treating. So I offered to go with them to like help keep track of all of them. And so my nephew, it was his first Halloween not in the pandemic where he could remember, walk up to houses, say trick or treat. And so he's very excited. And so he's very extroverted. He's like the most extroverted one in our entire family. And so he would go up with his sisters and knock on the door and say trick or treat. And then after they'd give him candy, he said, "Can I come look in your house?" And, and they would say, most of them would just laugh and think it was cute, but usually it's a no. Like, it's a no. Yeah. But he knows how to ask for what he wants, and that's kind of a silly example. But like, you need to be able to ask for what you're needing in the moment, but also be okay if it's a no. Like, Chris, if you had come to me and said, "Hey, I cannot guarantee you that this won't happen again, and it might happen all the time," like, I had to be okay with that going into that conversation. I had to be, the act of just bringing it up had to be enough in order to move forward. If you're going to go there and expect Chris to solve all your problems, or the symbol of Chris to solve all your problems, like, you're not going to walk away from that satisfied. So
exactly.
That's just the last kind of piece that I've learned from it since then, of like, just personally. But
I think that's a powerful way to end, to be honest, because that is maturity, right? And if we had more of that inside of our workplaces, like, oh my gosh, how far would we go?
Totally. Well, thank you for joining me for this conversation, revisiting that very fun conversation that we had. And we're looking forward to doing more episodes like this in the future, just deep diving into small aspects of each chapter of the book. If you have not read the book, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on our website, loveisabusinessstrategy.com. We would love for you to get a copy and tell us what you think. So with that, we'll talk to you guys later.
Goodbye.